First thing I want to talk about is why should I give this presentation? Well, basically, Maoism is an influential tendency on the left. It causes a lot of confusion for various people. Maoists and Trotskyists have generally not been able to be in the same organization. And hopefully, this talk should give people an idea of why. Yeah. So Maoism is a development of Stalinism. It's also influenced by Confucianism, which is a Chinese feudal philosophy. If you want to read about those influences, I can give you a book on it, but it's not that interesting. It primarily comes from the experience of the Chinese Revolution and takes its name from Mao Zedong, who was the historical leader of the Chinese Communist Party. And it's now an international tendency with active adherents around the world. So to understand Maoism, we need to have a brief historical understanding of the situation that China was in and the history of the Chinese Revolution. So in the early 1900s, China was suffering under the weight of foreign imperialism from the British, Portuguese, and lots of other Western powers, as well as corrupt feudal Qing dynasty that was basically holding China back. And the Qing dynasty was formally overthrown in 1912. Liberal republic that was established after that, called the Republic of China, was a completely ineffective government and was mostly powerless. It's also important to note that feudal elements remained throughout the countryside. This revolution kind of didn't do that much. A few years afterwards, the Chinese Communist Party was established in 1921 with help from the Soviet Union and the Comintern. And it's important to note that at this time, the strategy of the Comintern was international workers' revolution. And so the Chinese Communist Party was actually influential among the urban working class in China in its early years. However, in the international stage, there were defeats of attempted workers' revolutions in Italy and Germany, leading to the consolidation of fascism in those countries and the isolation of the Soviet Union, which led to the consolidation of a bureaucratic class in the Soviet Union, led by Stalin. This led to a rightward shift in the Comintern and caused them to give support for progressive bourgeois nationalism abroad, as sort of as a way to fast track creating new allies for the Soviet Union. In China, the meaning of this was basically that the Chinese Communist Party should align itself with the Kuomintang, or the Chinese Nationalist Party, to defeat the Qing aristocracy. Now, Trotsky argued against this primarily from a class independence point of view. And of course, this is something that we consider to be a disastrous alliance because, workers and capitalists have different interests, obviously. And unfortunately, the results of this disastrous alliance came to fruit in 1927, when the Kuomintang ordered the slaughter of the Chinese Communist Party. The alliance had always been uneasy, but in the years of 1925 through 1927, there were a series of disruptive strikes that were being led by the Chinese Communist Party. And of course, the capitalists didn't like that. So this guy, Chiang Kai-shek, basically ordered the slaughter of the Chinese Communist Party. And this brought down membership of the Chinese Communist Party disastrously. They were left with maybe a couple thousand members, if I remember correctly, and they were forced out to countryside. And from this point on, they basically have no influence in the working class and can never really regain it. Left with nothing and having to rebuild, they begin the task of rebuilding on the basis of the peasantry in rural China and start organizing a guerrilla army. And so during this period, Mao shows himself to be most up to the task, and he consolidates power in the party. A couple of years later, Japan invades China, and they quickly capture Beijing, Nanjing, and Shanghai. They end up committing numerous war crimes, most infamously the rape of Nanjing, where they slaughtered millions of Chinese over a 6-week period. And you can see that they capture such a huge section of China all these red areas without the lines are where the Japanese had control during their invasion, and the periods with the lines are where the parts with the lines are where the Chinese Communist Party has power. So at this point, basically, the Chinese Communist Party is engaged in a three-way fight between the Kuomintang and the Japanese. So Wang Ming, who was sort of the representative of the Soviet line in the Chinese Communist Party, at this point is still arguing for an alliance between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Nationalist Party. Just instead of against the Qing dynasty, it's against the Japanese. But the Kuomintang end up suffering a lot of embarrassing defeats against the Japanese. So Wang Ming loses influence and ends up falling out with the party, and this perspective kind of dies. So in 1945, the Japanese are defeated in World War II, and they're forced to withdraw from China. And shortly after that, the Kuomintang are defeated by the Chinese Communist Party. Hilariously enough, the Kuomintang thought they had everything secured and laid off all of their soldiers immediately afterwards. So then the Chinese Communist Party just basically rolled over them in the course of a year or two, I think. So at this point, the Kuomintang are driven out into Formosa, as it was known then. Now it's known as Taiwan. And the People's Republic of China is established. Now, the immediate effects of this revolution are basically to remove the remaining feudal elements, the feudal landlords out in the countryside, and to start the process of industrial development, give land back to the peasants. This is essentially a bourgeois revolution. Mao called the government a block of four classes, but in reality, the Chinese Communist Party was in control of everything. There was no, the four classes were workers, peasants, small capitalists, and big progressive capitalists. But the Chinese Communist Party is in control of everything, and not going to allow influence from any other class. At this point, Mao, and we need to take a step back and really think about the sort of theoretical background for the Chinese communists. The Chinese communists didn't have access to very much in the way of socialist theory because most of it wasn't available in Chinese. So only a minority of them are really educated in any Marxist texts, and then the ones who are basically receiving most of their education through Stalinized Marxism. So Mao basically tries to apply the same policies that Stalin did in Russia in order to rapidly industrialize China. And so he does the Great Leap Forward, which redirects a bunch of peasant labor towards industrial products rather than agricultural food products. And the result is widespread famine around the countryside, the largest man-made famine in human history, as far as I know, and a massive drop in GDP, which you can see here. So understandably, everybody else in the Chinese Communist Party is like, we can't do that again. That did not work. So they sidelined Mao because of the failure of the Great Leap Forward, and a perspective of capitalist rotors is what they were called in the Chinese Communist Party starts to take hold. And after being sidelined for a few years, Mao wants to regain power, and it basically senses that his perspective is losing out in comparison to the more right-wing elements. And he launches the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, or just the Cultural Revolution, in response. And is basically claiming that the party has been overtaken by bourgeois elements and that society needs a purge of all of the bourgeois elements in order to get on track for socialism. The results of this are basically that a bunch of youth and students form Red Guards. They end up massacring fellow workers and attacking authority figures. They destroy priceless historical artifacts. And there's just general chaos and destruction throughout the country. It's this ultra-left campaign where Mao is basically trying to regain power in the party, but it's just not successful, and ends up being politically exhausted by 1972. And again, there's a big economic impact of the Cultural Revolution if we look here. So this ends up turning the generation of Chinese that are around at the time against Mao, and against that perspective to some extent. And Deng Xiaoping, who's one of the more right-wing capitalist roaders, comes to power within the party. Mao dies in 1976, which is when historians formally mark the end of the Cultural Revolution. And his perspective is basically to open up China for foreign investment and trade, create a private capitalist sector. And this is the outlook that China has maintained basically since then. And this marks the end of the Maoist period. So in terms of the components of Maoism that come out of this, there's the mass line, People's War, Cultural Revolution, and they have a particular and kind of nationalist viewpoint of oppression and imperialism. So we'll talk about these components more later on. They also inherit pretty much the core parts of Stalinism, including socialism in one country, the idea that you can build socialism in just one country. And they inherit a top-down view of socialism and an elitist view of the party, like the idea that the party can run society on behalf of workers. So after this, it's important to note that the Maoist, Mao's regime was training other people to sort of establish their own Maoist countries. Or Maoist regimes, and a couple of movements that were inspired by Mao include the Shining Path of Peru, the Naxalites of India, the Black Panther Party, and lots of other organizations. Of course, I'm sure we all have experience with some certain local American Maoist organizations, but I think they're not worth mentioning in this presentation yet. Maybe in the discussion section. So I wanted to talk about the Shining Path just briefly because I feel like it's a good viewpoint of what Maoism as a sort of theoretical tradition looks like when it's tried to be, when they try to apply it. So this is just going to be a brief talk about the Shining Path, which was a Maoist organization in Peru. Peru began as a feudal state founded by Spanish conquistadors in 1542. It absorbs the former Incan Empire. Simón Bolívar, 300 years later, throws out the Spanish, and then Peru basically becomes dependent on foreign imperialism in order to survive, and has a history of going back and forth between liberal democracy and military dictatorship. One such period of military dictatorship was from 1968 to 1980. Now, previously in the 1920s, 30s, the Peruvian Communist Party had been established by a guy named Mariátegui. We should probably read his books sometime. Yeah, during the period of the military dictatorship, there were a lot of splits in the on the left and in the Communist Party, and one such split was the Shining Path, founded by Abimael Guzman, also known by his pen name Gonzalo, after a trip to Mao's China, where he was actually being educated by Mao's regime in his politics. And basically their orientation was, instead of organizing workers in the cities because they're too bought off or conservative or whatever, we're going to organize peasants in the rural areas and establish socialism that way. So for the first 10 years of the Shining Path's existence, they were mostly just building up their organization and creating cadre. But in 1980 is when the Shining Path really starts, like enters into the political scene. So 1980 marks the end of the Peruvian state's military dictatorship. They return the previous president, Belaunde, who had been overthrown in a military coup beforehand, returns to office. And the Shining Path basically denounces the elections and starts burning ballot boxes and calls for people's war against the Peruvian state. They also, at this point, demonstrate that they are willing to use violence against other groups on the left, including Marxists who are critical of them, and trade unionists. Essentially, anybody who's critical of them, they will assassinate or attack or beat or whatever. And initially, the Shining Path benefited from a tepid government response. If you remember, Belaunde was overthrown in the military coup, so he's not willing to give the military the full power that it needs to defeat the Shining Path necessarily. So instead, they're relying on rondas, which are groups of armed peasants, basically like a community defense organization, and the police to take down the Shining Path. And the Shining Path quickly takes over a couple of rural areas, and as soon as they get into power, they start getting into conflicts with the peasants. This goes back to their fundamentally undemocratic political outlook. Now, just to talk a little bit about the Shining Path, they were mostly middle-class intellectuals, were kind of the basis of the party. And their perspective was that they were going to march into these rural areas and declare themselves the leaders because they had the guns, basically. And this, immediately brings them into conflict with the people living there for very obvious reasons. Now, one such conflict was in Lucanamarca, a town, like a rural town out in Peru. So they had taken over the town, and then a ronda had attacked their base of operations and killed 13 of their guerrillas, including the commander who was stationed out there. And the Shining Path basically decided that, or accused the villagers there of supporting this attack, and decided to massacre the villagers and revenge. They killed 69 villagers, 18 of which were children, one of which was a 6-month-old baby. So that gives you an idea of just how liberatory their project really was. After the government has failed multiple times to get rid of the Shining Path, and using the police and the rondas and handicapping the military is not working, a guy named Fujimori wins presidency in 1990, and he initially has trouble getting Congress to approve the repression of the Shining Path using a military, and to get approval, basically he just suspends Congress and says, this is what I'm doing. I'm gonna have the military, I'm gonna take the gloves off, declare martial law, allow secret trials, and jail and disappear and execute anybody who seems even slightly sympathetic to the Shining Path. So this repression is disastrous for Peru. It causes the death of something like 70,000 Peruvians, about 600,000 people throughout Peru, and Peru and the Shining Path ends up actually dissolving because the Peruvian government finds out where Guzman is living, and they capture him and bring him to jail. As soon as Guzman ends up in jail, he starts compromising and starts calling for peace talks and all of that between the government and the Shining Path members. And because there's no internal leadership in the Shining Path apart from Guzman, the party splits and folds almost immediately. At the end of this conflict, basically both Fujimori and Guzman end up serving life sentences in jail. Fujimori mostly for these human rights abuses, and Guzman for Lucana Marca and for trying to overthrow the government. So this is the part of the talk where we kind of talk about the differences that we have with Maoism and the critiques that we have. In no particular order, socialism in one country. Our view is that socialism can't be built in just one country, and I think that's shown in practice. If you can't just hermetically seal a country off from the rest of the world and presume that that is going to be socialism. As long as there's other capitalist nations around there, you're going to have military competition, economic competition, and you're at best going to achieve a worker state. Another thing is that Maoists generally have a bureaucratic, top-down view of how the party should operate. Some of them even claim that there is an inherently petty bourgeois nature to the Revolutionary Party, which is, from our perspective, nonsense. From our perspective, the party needs to be democratic and accountable to the working class in order to succeed. And the Revolutionary Party is a party of the working class. It's not its keeper or its manager. It's not, it's not the representative of a better ruling class. It is the representative of the working class. Now, here's where we talk about the mass line. So the mass line is summarized by Maoists as from the masses to the masses. The idea is that you collect ideas from the masses, which could be any class, and bring it back to the party. The party then interprets the ideas of the masses and creates a revolutionary program, brings it back to the people for feedback. They take that feedback back to the party, so on and so forth. The problem with this approach is that it's not really a scientific way to determine your political line. In our situation, the vast majority of workers in the United States are not revolutionary. They're not interested in, getting rid of the US government. If we called for, the overthrow of the US government, the vast majority of workers would tell us to pound sand or something, So we need to come up with our line scientifically based on the class interests of the working class, and then argue for that and try to win people to that perspective, not try to accommodate to existing consciousness, which is what the mass line really ends up doing. The next critique that I have, and that I think we have generally, is of guerrilla warfare. So Maoists generally called for guerrilla warfare at the beginning. They call for military conflict by organizing out in the rural countryside, or maybe some Maoist organizations. Like I read about one in Argentina that tried some urban guerrilla warfare tactics. The problem with this is that armies are not democratic institutions. If we're building a guerrilla army, then we're building a chain of command, and it's just not a democratic institution. You have to maintain discipline. You have to follow the orders of your commanding officer. There's no room for debate about your orders when you're a soldier. So, if you're perspective is guerrilla warfare, then your perspective is that democracy is secondary, essentially. And you're not teaching your members how to engage in democratic debate and how to control and run society for themselves. Furthermore, in most cases, violence is going to decrease working class participation. It causes people to stand back, to become fearful, or to think that the activists currently engaging in violence or the guerrilla army are going to do it for them rather than them becoming a part of the process. So, you know, none of this is to say that we disagree with the use of violence, you know, for a revolution. It would be completely utopian for us to think that we could overthrow the government without guns. That would just be nonsense. But our perspective is that we need to organize among the rank and file of the military, because the rank and file of the military have guns already, and they don't derive any material benefits from being in the military. And we call to organize them and say to turn their guns instead of at us towards their superiors. Yeah. And this comes from the Russian Revolution, which, you know, the Russian army the rank and file of the Russian army actually turned their guns on the commanders. Besides that, Maoists have a particular viewpoint of oppression and imperialism. I think this viewpoint on oppression is really best represented by like the book Settlers by Sakai. Essentially, they argue that workers in imperialist countries benefit from imperialism, white workers benefit from racism, male workers benefit from patriarchy, etc. They have like a separatist perspective. Our viewpoint is that this harms solidarity between workers, and that the only real beneficiaries of oppression are the capitalist class and the corporations they own. Even though it is always better to be white than to be black, better to be in the U.S. than to be in a colonized country. An injury to one is an injury to all, and that applies to everybody in the working class, regardless of their opinions otherwise. So, in conclusion, Maoism did do some good things in China. It removed the feudal elements, got rid of the Japanese and the Kuomintang. China is not a vassal state of U.S. imperialism, which is a good thing. But China remains a class society. It's definitely not a socialist, and it's not a workers' state in any meaningful sense. The Chinese Communist Party is not a workers' party, and the applications that we've seen of Maoism, where there hasn't been a nationalist objective, like drawing out an imperialist aggressor or getting rid of feudal elements, have generally not been very successful. And the Shining Path is sort of emblematic of that. If you look at the recommended readings, like the Tithy article, she talks about how it went for the Naxalites, and it's very similar to the results that the Shining Path had, where there's just campaign of repression that ends up hitting the whole of society in a disastrous way, and there's not a lot that you get from in terms of positives at the end of it. And like I said, Maoism is a development of Stalinism, so it inherits all the problematic elements of Stalinism. Guerrilla warfare is undemocratic, doesn't lead to socialism, and they have a problematic view of oppression and imperialism. So I hope that clarifies for everybody what our differences are between us and Maoists, and I look forward to everybody's discussion.